There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They wear the camouflage of a Tuesday night, or the quiet hum of a refrigerator, or the familiar weight of a key in your hand as you unlock your own front door. You don't recognize them as watersheds at the time. They are simply minutes, unfolding as all the other minutes have. It is only later, when you trace the map of your life backward, that you see the sharp, definitive turn you took in that unassuming moment. You see the before and the after separated not by a canyon, but by a line so fine you could have missed it if you blinked. For me, that line was drawn on a rainy November evening, on the worn, gray fabric of our living room sofa. It was drawn by the simple, desperate weight of another person's exhaustion and the hesitant, terrifying extension of my own arm. He said he had a bad day. That was all. It was a phrase so common, so stripped of detail. It could have meant anything from a missed deadline to a global catastrophe. With Julian, it was usually the former, a cascade of corporate frustrations that he carried home with him like a coat he couldn't take off. He'd come through the door, his key hitting the small ceramic bowl on the entryway table with a clatter that was just a little too loud, a little too sharp. It was his tell, the sound of a tightly coiled spring. I was in the kitchen, ostensibly reading a book at the small table, but in reality, I was listening, as I always did, to the subtle meteorology of his arrival. The sigh as he dropped his messenger bag, the drag of his footsteps on the hardwood floor, the way the air itself seemed to grow dense around him. He was a low-pressure system moving into our small apartment, promising rain. He didn't speak as he came into the living room and collapsed onto the sofa, not so much sitting down as giving up his claim on verticality. He lay on his side, facing the back of the couch, one arm tucked beneath his head as a pillow, the other draped loosely over his stomach. He was still in his work clothes, a rumpled button-down shirt and dark trousers, and he looked like a figure carved from tension. Every line of his body, from the set of his shoulders to the slight clench in his jaw, spoke of a battle fought and lost. I watched him from the kitchen doorway, my book forgotten in my lap. For a long time, the only sounds were the tick of the clock on the wall and the gentle hiss of rain against the window panes. I felt like a cartographer, charting the geography of his silence, a landscape I knew intimately yet was always afraid to traverse. Finally, his voice came, muffled by the upholstery. Bad day. I didn't press for details. I had learned over the years that Julian processed his stress in his own time, in his own way. Prying was like trying to force open a fist. It only made him clench tighter. My role, the one I had silently accepted in the architecture of our friendship, was to be the space around him, the quiet room where he could finally unclench on his own. So I just nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, my voice softer than I intended. He made a non-committal sound, a low groan of assent that vibrated through the cushions. I went back to the kitchen, filled a glass with water, and brought it to him, setting it on the coaster on the end table beside his head. He didn't acknowledge it. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and tight. I retreated to the armchair opposite the sofa, picking up my book again, turning the pages without reading the words. The silence stretched, thick and heavy now, filled with all the things he wasn't saying. I could feel his restlessness radiating across the small room, a frantic, caged energy that had nowhere to go. He shifted, then shifted again, letting out a frustrated sigh. The stillness he was seeking was eluding him. His body was a battlefield, and he was losing. It was a familiar scene, this silent vigil. It had been the backdrop of our friendship for years. But that night, something was different. Perhaps it was the relentless drumming of the rain, a sound that seemed to amplify the quiet desperation in the room. Or perhaps it was something in me, a shift in my own tectonic plates, a growing impatience with the carefully constructed boundaries I had lived within for so long. Watching him struggle, so close and yet so far away, felt less like patience and more like a form of cowardice. He was drowning in a shallow pool of his own anxiety, and I was standing on the edge, holding a glass of water. I don't know how long I sat there, watching the rise and fall of his chest, the minute tremors that ran through his limbs. It could have been 10 minutes or an hour. Time had become syrupy, slow, and indistinct. But eventually, a thought, clear and sharp as a shard of glass, cut through my hesitation. He is here. He came home to this room, to this quiet, for a reason. It was a simple truth, but it felt profound. He hadn't gone to a bar, or called another friend, or sealed himself in his bedroom. He had brought his storm here, to our shared space. To me. I stood up, my joints protesting the sudden movement. I walked over to the sofa, my footsteps sounding unnaturally loud in the charged silence. I hesitated for a moment, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, my mind screaming 1,000 warnings about lines and rules and the fragile ecosystem of our friendship. Then I sat down on the floor, my back against the front of the sofa, so that my head was near his. I could feel the warmth of him through the cushions. I could hear his breathing, still tight, still uneven. We stayed like that for a while, two celestial bodies in a strange, silent orbit. Then, slowly, carefully, as if I were trying to disarm a bomb, I reached back with my right arm. I didn't plan it. The movement felt both alien and inevitable. I draped my arm over his side, my hand coming to rest on his shoulder. My touch was light, a question more than a statement. I was fully prepared for him to flinch, to pull away, to erect the barrier that my action had just threatened to dissolve. He didn't. Instead, something extraordinary happened. Under my hand, I felt the tension in his shoulder begin to dissolve. It was like watching ice melt and fast forward. A long, shuddering breath escaped his lips, a sound of such profound release that it seemed to carry with it the entire weight of his day. He shifted, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but it was toward me. He leaned into my arm, a subtle surrender. The frantic energy that had been radiating from him dissipated, replaced by a deep, resonant stillness. His breathing deepened, slowed, and finally found an even, rhythmic cadence. And in that unassuming moment, on that rainy Tuesday night, the world tilted on its axis. He had said he had a bad day, and he had only relaxed, truly and completely, when I put my arm around him. The line had been drawn, and I knew, with a terrifying and exhilarating certainty, that we had just crossed it together. To understand the sheer magnitude of that simple touch, you have to understand the foundation upon which it was laid. You have to understand the years of careful distance, of unspoken rules, of a friendship so precious to me that I had encased it in glass, terrified that a single wrong move would shatter it into a million irreparable pieces. Julian and I were a study in contrasts, a fact that had been obvious from the first day we met as randomly assigned roommates in a sterile, cinder-block dormitory. He had exploded into the room like a supernova, all bright energy and easy laughter, his arms full of boxes and his mouth full of stories. I, on the other hand, had already been there for an hour, my few possessions neatly arranged, sitting on my perfectly made bed and pretending to be engrossed in a campus map. I was a quiet planet, content in my own small orbit, and he was a sun, pulling everything and everyone into his gravitational field. I was prepared to dislike him. I was prepared for a year of loud music, strange visitors, and a constant, low-grade exhaustion from having to perform a version of myself that could coexist with his relentless extroversion. But Julian was not the stereotype I had cast him as. His energy was not invasive, it was inclusive. He didn't just talk. He listened, with a genuine, unnerving focus that made you feel like you were the only person in the universe. He saw my quiet not as a deficiency or a challenge, but simply as a different language. And to my astonishment, he learned to speak it. He learned to recognize the subtle shift in my posture that meant I was tired, the slight downturn of my mouth that meant something was wrong. He would simply appear with 2 mugs of tea, or suggest a walk, creating a space for me to talk if I wanted, but never demanding it. He adopted me, in a way. He pulled me into his circle of friends, but always with a protective arm, ensuring I was never overwhelmed. He was the bridge between my quiet interior world and the loud, chaotic world outside. And I, in turn, became his anchor. When the pressures of his engineering coursework became too much, or when the endless social obligations left him feeling hollowed out and frayed, he would retreat to the quiet of our room. He would just sit, sometimes for hours, while I sketched or read, soaking up the silence like a man dying of thirst. We were two halves of a whole, balancing each other's excesses and deficits. Our friendship became the bedrock of my college experience, the one constant in a sea of change. My feelings for him changed so gradually that I almost didn't notice it happening. It wasn't a lightning strike, a sudden, dramatic revelation. It was more like the slow, imperceptible turning of a season. It was in the way my stomach would tighten when he walked into a room, the way I found myself cataloging the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, the exact curve of his smile when he was genuinely happy. It was the ache in my chest when I saw him with someone else, an ache I disguised as platonic concern. The realization finally crystallized one night during our sophomore year. He had fallen asleep studying at his desk, his head pillowed on a massive physics textbook, his face softened and made vulnerable by sleep. The harsh fluorescent desk lamp cast his features in sharp relief, and I found myself just staring, tracing the lines of his face with my eyes. In that moment, the love I felt for him was so overwhelming, so potent. It was a physical presence in the room. It was not the comfortable, steady love of a friend. It was something wilder, more profound, and infinitely more dangerous. That was the night I built the first wall. I understood, with the brutal clarity of fear, that to confess these feelings would be to risk the entire foundation of my life. The friendship we had was too important, too vital, to gamble on the slim chance that he might feel the same way. Julian was like the sun, and I knew that getting too close could only result in my own incineration. So I buried it. I packed those feelings away into a small, locked room in the deepest part of my heart. I learned to control my breathing when he was close, to master the neutral expression, to offer a friendly hug that betrayed none of the desperate longing I felt. I became a masterful architect of my own interior world, constructing walls and buffers and carefully guarded spaces to ensure the truth would never escape. My love for him became a secret garden, one I tended to only in the privacy of my own thoughts, beautiful and painful in equal measure. After college, we got an apartment together. It seemed like the most natural thing in the world. Our lives were intertwined in a way that felt permanent. He began his demanding career as a consultant, a job that suited his personality but often left him drained and depleted. I pursued my photography, a quiet, solitary profession that allowed me to continue my life's work of observation. We orbited each other, our routines a familiar, comforting dance. He had girlfriends, of course, bright, beautiful women who were drawn to his light, just as I was. I was always polite, always friendly. I learned their names, asked about their lives, and felt a piece of myself chip away with each new introduction. Clara was the most serious. They were together for nearly 3 years, a fixture in our lives. She was kind and smart, and I think she genuinely liked me. But she was also a constant, painful reminder of the unbridgeable distance between Julian and me. She was the rightful inhabitant of a country where I was, and always would be, a tourist. I watched him love her, and I learned to live with the quiet hum of heartbreak that became the background noise of my life. The shift began not with a bang, but with a slow, drawn-out sigh. Julian and Clara's relationship didn't end in a dramatic fight. It simply eroded over time, worn down by the friction of two people wanting fundamentally different things from life. He traveled constantly for work, and she wanted to put down roots. He was content with the life they had, and she was dreaming of a future he couldn't seem to picture. The breakup, when it finally came, was more of a mutual, sorrowful agreement than a separation. It was quiet, civilized, and it left Julian utterly adrift. He wasn't heartbroken in the traditional sense. He was disoriented. He had lost his primary coordinate, the fixed point around which his personal life had revolved. His orbit began to decay. He started coming home from his business trips and just stopping. The vibrant energy that had always defined him seemed to dim, the light banking low like embers. He'd cancel plans with friends, claiming he was too tired from work. He'd spend entire weekends in the apartment, drifting from room to room like a ghost, his usual restlessness now tinged with a deep, pervasive loneliness that he never spoke of but that clung to him like a scent. He was an engine without a destination, and the silence in our apartment grew louder, heavier, filled with the vacuum her absence had created. I watched him, my heart aching with a mixture of sympathy and a selfish, terrible hope that I immediately felt guilty for. I maintained my careful distance, offering quiet company, making sure there was always food in the fridge, being the steady, predictable presence I had always been. I didn't know what he needed, but I knew he needed something. The carefully balanced ecosystem of our lives had been disrupted, and I could feel the ground shifting beneath my feet. He was searching for a new anchor, and I was terrified that he might drift away entirely, but even more terrified that he might, for the first time, drift towards me. The ritual began subtly, as most profound changes do. It started with movies on the couch. We had always done this, but now it became a nightly occurrence, a default setting for our evenings. He would choose the film, usually something loud and distracting, and I would make popcorn. We'd settle at opposite ends of the sofa, a respectable, platonic distance between us. But as the weeks passed, the space began to shrink. One night, he fell asleep halfway through, his head slumping sideways until it came to rest against my shoulder. My entire body went rigid. I sat there for the entire second half of the movie, my muscles screaming, afraid to breathe too deeply for fear of waking him. His presence was a brand, a searing heat against my side. I studied the relaxed line of his jaw, the gentle flutter of his eyelashes against his cheek. It was an intimacy so profound, so far beyond the established boundaries of our friendship, that it felt like a violation. But it was a violation he had initiated, in the plausible deniability of sleep. When the credits rolled, I gently shook him awake. He blinked, disoriented, and mumbled an apology before shuffling off to his room, seemingly oblivious to the earthquake that had just torn through my inner world. This became the first step in our new, unspoken dance. He would fall asleep against me more and more often. It was never planned, never discussed. It just happened. His exhaustion became a passport, allowing him entry into my personal space without a formal declaration. My shoulder, my lap, the space next to my legs, they became his designated harbors. I lived for these moments and dreaded them in equal measure. The proximity was a sweet agony, a taste of a reality I had long since convinced myself I could never have. I would sit in the dim light of the television, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm, committing every detail to memory, the weight of his head, the scent of his shampoo, the soft sound of his breathing. I was a man starving, being offered crumbs from a feast I could see but never join. The ritual escalated. One night, after a particularly grueling week of travel, he came into the living room while I was reading. He looked pale and hollowed out. He didn't say anything, just stood in the doorway, looking lost. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice betraying my concern. He shook his head, a small, tired movement. "Nightmares," he said, the word barely a whisper. "Just can't seem to turn my brain off." He looked towards his bedroom, then back at me, a flicker of something desperate in his eyes. Would you mind just sitting with me for a bit? Until I fall asleep." The request hung in the air between us, heavy and fragile. It was a direct appeal, a step beyond the accidental intimacy of the couch. My carefully constructed walls trembled. To say no would be cruel, a rejection of a friend in need. To say yes felt like stepping off a cliff. "Of course," I heard myself say. I followed him to his room. The space felt charged, foreign. I had been in his room hundreds of times, but never like this, never for this purpose. He climbed into bed and pulled the covers up to his chin. I perched awkwardly on the edge of the mattress, my back ramrod straight, feeling like an intruder. He turned on his side to face me, his eyes already heavy-lidded. "Thanks, Leo," he murmured. "You're grounding." The word struck me. Grounding. I was his earth, the thing that stopped him from floating away. I sat there in the semi-darkness, listening to his breathing slow and deepen, until I was sure he was asleep. Only then did I allow myself to leave, retreating to my own room with a heart that felt both impossibly full and painfully empty. This became the new phase of the ritual. On the bad nights, the really bad nights, I would become his silent sentinel, a human dream catcher perched at the edge of his consciousness. Then came the door. He started leaving his bedroom door ajar at night. Not wide open, but just a crack. It was a sliver of an invitation, a line of light cutting through the darkness of the hallway. It was a statement of profound and terrifying ambiguity. It could mean nothing. It could be a simple oversight, a habit born of a new, post-Clara loneliness. Or it could mean everything. It could be a question, an offering. I am here. I am vulnerable. The way is not barred. I would lie in my own bed, staring at the ceiling, hyper-aware of that sliver of light, of the unlocked door, of the man sleeping just down the hall. The apartment, once a simple collection of rooms, had been transformed into a complex emotional landscape of boundaries and invitations, of open doors and the vast, terrifying spaces between them. The final escalation came on the night of the storm, the same night that would end with my arm around him on the sofa. But the true turning point happened later, after he had fallen asleep there, deeply and peacefully. I couldn't bring myself to wake him and send him to his own bed. It felt like breaking a spell. So I let him sleep, eventually dozing off myself in the armchair. I woke hours later, sometime after midnight, to the sound of him stirring. The rain had stopped, and the room was filled with the eerie, orange glow of the city at night. He sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes, and looked at me. "I should go to bed," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "Yeah," I said, my own voice hoarse. He stood up and stretched, a groan escaping his lips. He started toward his room, then stopped in the hallway. He turned back, and in the dim light, his face was an unreadable mask of exhaustion and something else, something I couldn't name. "Leo?" "Yeah." He hesitated, and in that pause, I felt the entire history of our friendship, all the unspoken rules and guarded feelings, holding its breath. "Just for tonight," he said, his voice so quiet I had to strain to hear it. "Can you stay?" It wasn't a request to sit by his bed. The look in his eyes made that clear. It was an invitation to cross the final threshold. And as I looked at him, standing in the hallway, looking so utterly lost and alone, I knew that all my walls, all my carefully constructed defenses, had been for nothing. They crumbled into dust with that one, whispered question. I could not deny him. I could not deny myself. I gave a single, slow nod, and I followed him into his room, closing the door behind us, shutting out the world, and stepping into a new one, a place of terrifying and beautiful uncertainty, where the only map was the sound of his breathing in the dark. That first night in his bed was a landscape of chaste tension. We lay on opposite sides of the mattress, a gulf of white sheets between us, our backs to each other. Every nerve in my body was on fire. I was acutely aware of his warmth, the subtle shifts of his weight, the sound of the air moving in and out of his lungs. It was an intimacy so profound it was almost unbearable. I didn't sleep a wink, but I pretended to, for his sake. I was a statue, carved from fear and longing, lying beside the man who was the sole curator of my heart. In the morning, he was gone before I woke, and we didn't speak of it. It became another unspoken secret, a shared experience that existed in a pocket of reality we couldn't acknowledge in the light of day. But the ritual was now complete. On the nights when the world had taken too much from him, he would find his way to my side, and I would lie awake in the darkness, his silent, secret guardian. The couch, the chair by his bed, the open door, they had all been stepping stones leading to this, a shared space of silent, desperate comfort. And I, the quiet observer, had become a participant in a story whose ending I could not begin to imagine. The night of the kiss felt different from the start. A fragile peace had settled over the apartment in the preceding days. Julian had been home, a rare stretch of a week without travel, and the frantic, frayed energy that usually clung to him had receded. He seemed more himself, the easy laughter returning, the light coming back into his eyes. The rituals of comfort had been suspended, There were no bad days, no nightmares, no unspoken pleas for proximity. We had reverted to our old, comfortable friendship, and a part of me was relieved, while another, traitorous part of me ached with a sense of loss. The ambiguity was a form of torture, but its absence was a form of loneliness. That evening, we were lying in his bed, but this time it felt less like a necessity and more like a choice. A quiet magnetism had pulled us there after a movie, a natural extension of the evening's ease. We were on our sides, facing each other, the space between us no longer a chasm of unspoken rules, but a comfortable, shared territory. The only light came from the city outside, painting silver stripes across the comforter. His eyes, usually clouded with exhaustion on nights like these, were clear and awake. He was watching me with an intensity that made my breath catch in my throat. He wasn't looking at me as his friend, his roommate, his grounding force. He was looking at me as if he were seeing me for the first time. The silence was not heavy or anxious. It was soft and expectant, like the quiet just before dawn. I could have stayed in that moment forever, suspended in the warmth of his gaze, in the peaceful space we had carved out of the night. But Julian, the unknowing initiator, the one who always set our world in motion, was about to do it again. "Leo," he whispered, his voice a low vibration in the quiet room. "Yeah," I managed, my own voice barely audible. He didn't break his gaze. His eyes searched mine, and I felt utterly exposed, as if he could see straight through to that secret room in my heart, the one I had kept locked for so long. He saw the years of hidden affection, the quiet ache, the patient, hopeless love. "Can I ask you something?" he said, and the words were laced with a vulnerability I had never heard from him before. I could only nod, my throat suddenly tight. He took a slow, deliberate breath, as if steeling himself. The air in the room felt electric, charged with the weight of the impending question. I felt the axis of my world begin to tilt once more. "Would it be okay?" he began, his voice dropping even lower, so soft it was almost lost in the hum of the city. He paused, and the hesitation was a confession in itself. "Would it be okay if I kissed you?" The world stopped. The ticking of the clock, the distant wail of a siren, my own frantic heartbeat, it all went silent. His question wasn't a proposition or a challenge. It was a plea for permission. It was an admission of a desire that he was terrified to name, an offering of his own vulnerability laid bare for my acceptance or rejection. In that one question, he was giving me all the power, acknowledging the line between us and asking if I was willing to erase it with him. The architect of my own prison, I was suddenly being handed the key by the one person I had built the walls to protect myself from. I couldn't find my voice. The words were tangled in a knot of shock and a joy so potent it was painful. So I did the only thing I could. I gave another small, shaky nod. That was all the answer he needed. He moved slowly, cautiously, closing the small distance between us. I saw his eyes flutter shut just before his lips met mine. The kiss was not what I had imagined in my years of secret daydreams. It was not passionate or demanding or cinematic. It was tentative, soft, and breathtakingly gentle. It was a question, a confirmation, and an apology all in one. It was the taste of rain and salt, a quiet exploration in the dark. His hand came up to cup my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek, and the simple, tender gesture shattered the last of my defenses. I felt a single, hot tear escape my eye and trace a path down my temple. When he pulled back, it was only by an inch. He opened his eyes, and they were dark and deep and full of 1,000 emotions I couldn't begin to decipher. Fear, relief, wonder. He rested his forehead against mine, and we just breathed together in the darkness, the shared air a testament to the irrevocable act that had just passed between us. The ritual was broken. The ambiguity was gone. We had crossed the line, not by stumbling over it in the dark, but by taking each other's hand and stepping over it, deliberately and together. It was a beginning, and it was an end, and in the quiet aftermath of that first, hesitant kiss, I felt a profound and terrifying peace. The future was a blank page, but for the first time, I felt like we might be writing it together. The peace was a fragile, beautiful mirage. It shattered with the morning light. I woke slowly, coming up from the first deep, dreamless sleep I'd had in months. A sense of warmth and rightness settled deep in my bones. I reached out, my hands searching for the solid, reassuring presence of Julian beside me, but it found only cool, empty sheets. My eyes snapped open. The space next to me was vacant, the pillow indented where his head had been. A chill, entirely unrelated to the morning air, crept over my skin. I sat up, listening. The apartment was silent. Not the comfortable, lived-in silence of a shared morning, but a stark, hollow silence that echoed with absence. I got out of bed, his bed, and walked into the living room. Everything was neat, tidy, and empty. A single white mug, his favorite, sat clean and dry in the dish rack. On the small entryway table, next to the ceramic bowl, his keys were gone. My phone, lying on the coffee table, lit up with a new message. My heart hammered against my ribs as I picked it up. It was from him. "Hey, sorry to rush out. Early meeting I forgot about. See you tonight." That was it. No mention of the night before. No acknowledgement of the kiss that had redrawn the map of our entire universe. Just a sterile, polite, logistical message. It was a slammed door in text form. The warmth in my chest from the night before curdled into a cold, hard knot of dread. I read the message again and again, trying to decode it, to find some hidden layer of meaning, but there was none. It was exactly what it appeared to be, an evasion, a retreat. The day was interminable. I tried to work, to edit the photos from a recent shoot, but the images on the screen were just meaningless shapes and colors. My mind was a frantic loop, replaying the kiss, his question, the look in his eyes, and then crashing against the brutal wall of his morning text. Doubt, a creeping, poisonous vine, began to wrap itself around my heart. Had I imagined the tenderness? Had I misinterpreted the vulnerability? Maybe it had been a mistake for him. A moment of lonely confusion after his breakup with Clara, a desperate reach for comfort that had gone too far. Maybe he woke up in the light of day filled with regret, horrified by what he had done. And I, in my pathetic, hopeful eagerness, had let him. I felt like a fool, my heart exposed and bruised. The architect had not been handed a key. He had been tricked into opening the door himself, only to have it slammed shut in his face. The friendship I had guarded so fiercely for years. I had risked it all for a moment that he had already discarded as a mistake. When he came home that evening, the change in the atmosphere was immediate and suffocating. The easy intimacy we had shared was gone, replaced by a strained, painful politeness. He was formal, distant. He asked about my day with the detached interest of a casual acquaintance. He kept himself busy, making dinner, cleaning the kitchen, creating a buffer of activity and noise to fill the space where conversation should have been. He wouldn't meet my eyes for more than a second. The open door between our lives was now firmly, irrevocably shut. He had rebuilt the wall between us, brick by painful brick, and I was left on the outside, shivering in the cold. This Cold War lasted for a week. A week of stilted conversations, of careful avoidance, of sleeping in our own separate rooms with our doors closed. The apartment, our sanctuary, became a minefield of unspoken tension. Every shared space was a potential point of collision, every silence a deafening accusation. The ritual of comfort was a distant memory, a dream I wasn't sure had ever been real. I was oscillating between anger and a deep, profound hurt. I was angry at him for his cowardice, for refusing to face what had happened between us. But mostly, I was hurt that he could so easily dismiss a moment that had felt so sacred to me. The hope that had bloomed in the darkness of his room withered under the harsh, fluorescent light of his avoidance. By the end of the week, I couldn't bear it anymore. The silence was more damaging than any argument could ever be. It was eroding the very foundations of our friendship, the one thing I had always tried to protect. If our friendship was going to die, I decided it would not die of neglect. It would die with me looking it in the eye. I found him in the living room, standing by the window, staring down at the city lights, the exact same posture of quiet turmoil he held on so many of his bad days. But this time, I knew I was the cause of the storm. I took a deep breath, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. Julian. He flinched at the sound of his name, but he didn't turn around. Hey, he said, his voice flat. We need to talk about it, I said, my own voice shaking slightly, but firm. You can't just pretend it didn't happen. It's not fair. He was silent for a long moment, his shoulders tensed. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, the lie so blatant it was insulting. A surge of anger, hot and sharp, cut through my fear. Don't, I said, my voice rising. Don't do that. Don't treat me like I'm crazy. You asked me. You kissed me. And now you're acting like I don't exist. You owe me an explanation. Or at least the decency of honesty. He finally turned from the window, and the look on his face stopped me cold. It wasn't anger or annoyance. It was fear. He looked terrified, cornered, like an animal caught in a trap. His carefully constructed composure crumbled, and all the confusion and turmoil he'd been hiding came rushing to the surface. I can't, he whispered, his voice cracking. Leo, I can't. Why not? I pressed, my anger softening into a painful confusion. Was it a mistake? Is that it? Just tell me it was a mistake and you regret it. At least then I'll know. No, he said, the word exploding out of him, raw and desperate. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing the small space between the window and the sofa. That's the problem. It wasn't a mistake. It's the only thing that's felt real in months. He stopped pacing and looked at me, his eyes wide with a kind of panicked sincerity. That's what scares me, he confessed, his voice dropping again, thick with emotion. For years, my life has been this. This path. College, job, girlfriend, the whole thing. It was all planned out. I knew what it was supposed to look like. And then Clara and I ended, and the path just disappeared. I was lost. He gestured vaguely around the room, at the space between us. And then this. With you. The quiet, the comfort. It was the only thing that made sense. Coming home to you was the only time I didn't feel like I was completely adrift. And that night, when I kissed you, it wasn't a mistake. It felt like finding north. It was the most honest I've been with myself in years. He finally collapsed onto the sofa, burying his face in his hands. His voice was muffled, full of self-loathing. And it petrifies me, Leo, because this wasn't part of the plan. You weren't part of the plan, not like this. I don't know what it means. I don't know what to do with it. And I was so scared of ruining the one good thing I had left, our friendship, that I just ran. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm such a coward. His confession, raw and painful and utterly honest, washed over me, extinguishing the last of my anger. All the hurt, all the confusion of the past week, dissolved in the face of his own fear. He hadn't been rejecting me. He had been terrified of accepting himself. He wasn't running from me. He was running from the profound, unexpected truth of his own heart. I walked over to the sofa and sat down beside him, the space between us no longer a battlefield, but a place of fragile truce. I didn't reach for him, not yet. I just sat there, breathing with him, letting his words settle in the quiet room. The confrontation was over. The conversation was about to begin. The silence that followed his confession was of a different quality entirely. It was not the strained, anxious silence of the past week, nor the expectant, charged silence from before the kiss. This was a cleared space, a foundation swept clean of debris, waiting for something new to be built. All the ambiguity, all the pretense, had been burned away by the raw heat of his honesty. We were left with a truth that was both terrifying and liberating. He was afraid, and I was in love, and for the first time, both of those things were allowed to exist in the same room, spoken and acknowledged. I let him breathe for a few long moments before I spoke, my voice quiet but steady. You don't have to have a plan, Julian. He lifted his head from his hands, his eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. It's all I've ever had, he said, his voice rough. Without a map, I just feel like I'm walking in circles in the dark. Maybe you just need a different kind of map, I suggested gently. Maybe it's not about a destination. Maybe it's just about the next right step. I took a breath, preparing to step off my own cliff. For years, I began, my gaze fixed on my hands, clasped in my lap. I've had this room inside me, a place where I kept how I felt about you locked away, because I was so terrified of losing you. I thought our friendship was this fragile, glass thing that would shatter if I put any weight on it. I never, ever thought you might be feeling anything even remotely similar. I finally looked up and met his eyes. You said kissing me felt like finding North. For me, it felt like coming home. A home I never thought I'd be allowed to enter. So you can be scared. It's okay to be scared. I've been scared for almost a decade. But we don't have to be scared alone anymore. His expression softened, the fear receding to reveal a deep, bone-weary sadness and a flicker of something else. Hope. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before he covered my clasped hands with his own. His touch was warm and firm. It was not the desperate, seeking touch of his bad days. It was an intentional connection, a conscious choice. "How did you do it?" he asked, his voice full of wonder. "How did you live with it for so long? And I never knew." "I'm a photographer," I said with a small, wry smile. "I'm good at framing things, at controlling the focus. I just kept you in the background. The most beautiful, most important part of the composition, but never the subject." I squeezed his hand. "I think I was wrong about that." That conversation was the beginning of our new foundation. We talked for hours, late into the night. We dismantled the entire history of our friendship and reassembled it with this new, astonishing truth at its center. I told him about the night in our dorm room when I first realized my feelings. He told me about how his relationship with Clara had felt increasingly hollow, how he'd felt a pull towards the quiet and stability of our apartment, of me, without ever understanding why. He admitted that his feelings for me had been there all along, developing slowly in the dark, like one of my photographs, and that the kiss had been the moment the image finally became clear. He had been so used to seeing me as his friend, his anchor, that he hadn't recognized the shape of love when it was right in front of him. There was no single, dramatic moment of resolution. Instead, it was a series of small, quiet acceptances. The new normal began to establish itself not with declarations, but with actions. The next morning, when I woke up, it was to the smell of coffee. I walked into the kitchen to find him there, 2 mugs already filled. He looked up and smiled, a real, unguarded smile, and the simple domesticity of the scene felt more profound than any grand romantic gesture. He handed me a mug, his fingers brushing against mine, a casual touch that was now laden with a new, beautiful significance. The closed doors disappeared. We started sleeping in the same bed every night, not out of necessity or comfort for a bad day, but because it was where we both wanted to be. The vast, tense space between us was gone, replaced by a comfortable proximity. We would lie facing each other and talk about our days, or lie with him curled against my back, his arm draped over my side, his breathing a steady, comforting rhythm against my skin. The physical contact was no longer a source of anxiety, but a language of its own, a constant, silent conversation of reassurance and affection. One afternoon, about a week later, I was sorting through prints in the living room when he came home from work. He dropped his keys in the bowl, but the clatter was soft, measured. He came over to where I was sitting on the floor, surrounded by images, and knelt down behind me. He wrapped his arms around my chest and rested his chin on my shoulder, his gaze taking in the photos spread out before us. He didn't say anything. He just held me. It was a mirror of that first night on the couch, the night the line was drawn, but everything was different. His touch was not a surrender to exhaustion, but a confident, loving embrace. My response was not a hesitant, terrified offering, but a relaxed lean into his strength. We had come full circle, but the landscape was transformed. The fear didn't vanish overnight. There were still moments of uncertainty, of navigating this new territory. But the difference was that we could talk about it. We could name the fear, hold it up to the light together, and watch it shrink. The architecture of our relationship was no longer a series of walls and guarded rooms, but an open, shared space we were building together, board by board, nail by nail. It was a home, built on a foundation of years of friendship and cemented with the courageous, terrifying mortar of honesty. We learn, eventually, that the most important journeys are not the ones we plan. The maps we draw for ourselves in our youth are often just rough sketches of a country we have never seen. The real topography of our lives is revealed to us step by step, often in the moments we feel most lost. We search for grand landmarks, for epic mountain ranges and sweeping coastlines, when in fact, our true destination is often a quiet harbor we mistake for just another port in a storm. It is the place where we can finally lower our anchor, where the frantic energy of the open sea gives way to a profound and gentle stillness. It is not a place on a map at all, but a person. For me, that harbor was always Julian. I had just been too afraid to come ashore. But now, in the beautiful, honest silence we learned to create together, we were both finally home.